Elijah's voice thundered through the chaos as he conjured an earthen wall between the charging mana beasts and the terrified students. Dust and rock rose into the air, forming a crude barrier in seconds, but the protection came too late for one. He watched helplessly as a dwarven student was torn apart by the gaping maw of a black-fanged wolf, its fur discolored with a sickly, corrupted hue. Another student wasn't spared either. As the beast climbed over the wall with relentless fury, 3 of them lunged at him, pinning him to the ground. The boy clenched his jaw, eyes wide as death loomed inches from his face. Elijah reacted instinctively. Rock spears shot out from the earth beneath the creatures, impaling them through their vulnerable bellies. The beast collapsed in twitching heaps, their blood soaking into the ground. Without wasting a second, Elijah bolted from the scene, his eyes scanning the area, desperate for some understanding of what was happening. The campus that once held calm now echoed with unrelenting screams, explosions, and the growls of mana beasts. His gaze snapped toward a group gathered near a raised platform, where an unsettling figure stood, making an announcement. A high-pitched, grating voice cut through the air, unnatural in its tone and amplified across the battlefield. The speaker declared themselves as a master over the mana beasts, offering immunity to human students in exchange for loyalty, while condemning elves and dwarves to have their mana cores destroyed. Laughter followed, twisted, deranged, and it clawed its way into Elijah's spine like ice. A storm of thoughts raged in his mind. How had the academy fallen so far? How could the staff? How could Director Goodsky allow things to deteriorate to this extent? His confusion was shattered by screams, real and near. A few meters away, an elven girl struggled in terror, pleading to be released as a professor held her tightly from behind, violating every ounce of trust once placed in Xyrus Academy. The sight rooted Elijah in horror for a breath, but only for a breath. Rage ignited. Even the professors were cultists. His fury surged through his mana channels. With a roar, he conjured jagged shards of rock and hurled them toward the traitorous professor. But the man was prepared. Drawing his wand, he conjured an ice barrier just in time, blocking the projectiles with a sneer. His amusement showed clearly, even amidst the carnage, signaling Elijah to back off unless he wanted to die. Before Elijah could act further, the situation shifted. Grotter, Curtis's bond, lunged forward with immense force and slammed into the rogue professor, knocking him violently out of position. The impact sent the cultist stumbling and reeling across the dirt-stained campus grounds, unable to regain balance. Without hesitation, Curtis commanded his bond to stay alert and guard the group. Surrounded and outnumbered, the professor quickly assessed his odds. With a sneer of frustration, he chose flight over confrontation, dashing away from the scene, disappearing into the chaos without looking back. Curtis wasted no time. He instructed the elven girl to make her way to the training facility, where a few reliable professors were still believed to be holding the line. Grateful, the girl offered a quick thank you before disappearing into the fray. Elijah turned to Curtis, relief washing over his face at the familiar sight. He asked urgently about the state of the disciplinary committee. Curtis responded with grim honesty. Most of the members were alive, though scattered, searching for support. But then came the heavier news. Doradrea and Ferrith hadn't made it out. They had held off the cultists, sacrificing their escape to give others a chance. The weight of their absence settled immediately in Elijah's chest. Desperation crept in as Elijah pushed for more answers. Arthur, Tessia, the rest of the student council, where were they? Curtis explained that neither Arthur nor Tessia had returned to the school, which, given the current state of affairs, might be a blessing. The student council members, though alive, had been split up during the initial attack. Lilia and Clive were separated from the others, their whereabouts uncertain. Elijah, overwhelmed, asked what could possibly be done now. Curtis didn't have answers, only bleak possibilities. Survival, maybe. Holding out long enough for soldiers to arrive, or for the lances to finally mobilize. But before either could speak again, a thunderous boom erupted across the campus. The sound shattered the air so loud it could only have been enhanced with mana. Elijah couldn't even hear his own voice as he screamed in instinctive panic, clutching his ears as pain lanced through his head. Beside him, Curtis winced in agony, both of them staggering under the auditory assault. Then came the voice, unnerving, theatrical, and echoing from the bell tower near the center of campus. A masked figure had taken position high above, his tone dripping with mockery and twisted amusement. He announced a gathering, an invitation of sorts, for what he called the final ceremony. Every student and faculty member still alive was advised to make their way toward the tower. There, he promised, awaited a spectacle no one would want to miss. And in a final stroke of cruelty, he assured them that the mana beasts would no longer attack, at least for now. Outside the grand gates of Xyrus Academy, a wave of panic had begun to swell. Dozens of parents stood pressed against the barrier, their voices rising in fear and desperation. A father near the front of the line shouted in distress, his voice cracking as he demanded to know what was happening inside. He had tried reaching his daughter countless times, but received nothing in return. Around him, others echoed the same fear, their panic feeding into each other like wildfire. Why were they being kept outside? Why hadn't the school responded? Near the perimeter, professors stood tense, barely able to contain the situation. One of them stepped forward, urgently warning the crowd to stay away from the magical barrier. He pleaded for calm, assuring them that mages were working as fast as they could, but even his voice betrayed his lack of confidence. Another professor turned abruptly to one of the stationed mages and demanded a status report. The mage, flustered and breathless, responded with troubling news. Neither the Mages Guild nor the Artificers Guild had ever encountered a barrier like the one now enclosing the academy. Its structure was foreign, entirely unlike any known magical constructs. The professor's patience frayed. He wasn't interested in theoretical differences. He wanted a solution. Could they break through it? The mage shook his head, admitting that the artifacts they currently had on hand were insufficient. Reinforcements had been requested, specifically a large-scale beam drill from the Artificers Guild in Dicathen, but even that city seemed to be under duress, facing problems of its own. In desperation, the student mage suggested the possibility of calling for a lance, hoping that their overwhelming power might shatter the barrier, but the professor cut him off sharply, voice tight with frustration. That had already been attempted. All the lances were occupied, scattered across the continent, dealing with similar incidents. His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The realization hit the mage mid-sentence. Was this part of a larger coordinated attack? But before he could say more, the professor stepped forward and clamped a hand over his mouth, silencing him instantly. There was no room for hysteria. Not now, not when every second mattered. Whispers of a continent-wide conspiracy would only worsen the chaos. The mage, pale and wide-eyed, steadied himself and continued with a quieter tone. The guild had already deployed teams around the entire base of the barrier, searching for weak points. It would take time, but they would break through. They had to. The professor nodded grimly, his expression hardening as the dreadful reality sank in. He didn't voice his thoughts aloud, but they were etched across his face. Just hope that they are not too late. Meanwhile, inside the academy atop his world lion grotter, Curtis raised his left arm high, signaling the students who had gathered near. Without hesitation, Elijah and a few others began to follow. The only path left to them was toward the bell tower, the source of the chaos, and possibly the answers. Pushing through rubble and wounded bodies, Elijah called out while clearing a path. Curtis halted briefly, turning to him. With a solemn nod, Curtis informed Elijah of his next move. He would try to locate the remaining members of the disciplinary committee. He asked Elijah to stay behind. Elijah stood frozen for a moment as Curtis disappeared into the swirling mayhem. Around him, the devastation was suffocating. Students lay bruised, bloodied, and broken. Many clutched the bodies of fallen friends, wailing in grief. Others wandered in shock, their minds unable to comprehend the nightmare that had unfolded. Several of Xyrus Academy's faculty had gathered in one place, their robes torn and faces marked with strain. United, 4 professors raised their hands and unleashed a volley of high-tier spells against the barrier that entrapped the school. Not a single crack formed. The barrier stood flawless and defiant. Behind them, the students erupted in panic. Their voices, sharp with fear, broke through the din, pleading, crying, demanding to be freed. They screamed at their captors, disbelief etched across their young faces. Why was this happening? Why weren't the adults saving them? Then the voice returned, the same grating, high-pitched tone that had already haunted their minds once before. It pierced through the chaos, commanding attention as every head turned toward the bell tower once again. The figure stood at its edge, bold and unafraid, draped in dark robes and adorned with a grotesque mask. The man held his posture like a performer before a captive audience. Then the resistance came. Fury erupted from the crowd. Students, overcome by desperation, raised their trembling hands and launched spells of their own. Spears of earth shot upward. Blades of fire and wind sliced through the air, but even this final act of defiance crumbled before it could touch him. The projectiles collided against a translucent magical shield, shattering instantly like glass against stone. The man's shoulders trembled, but not from fear. He was laughing, struggling to contain it. His voice had mocked them before, but now it twisted deeper, taunting their pain, reveling in their hopelessness. Then, without ceremony, he tossed an object onto the ground from behind his back. The item bounced once before rolling to a stop near the front of the crowd. For a moment, no one moved. Then they saw it. Those nearest recoiled in horror. It was a head, severed cleanly, eyes dull and lifeless. Recognition spread like a virus. Elijah stood frozen, his eyes locked onto the horrifying sight. The image refused to register at first, but then realization struck him like a hammer to the chest. A sickening wave rolled through his body. He fell to his knees and vomited. Trembling, he could barely breathe. In the depth of his soul, he hoped he was wrong, hoped it wasn't her, but someone else had already recognized the victim. A piercing howl echoed across the field, louder than any before. Theodore surged forward, fury tearing through every fiber of his being. He barreled past the other students, shoving aside those not quick enough to escape his path. He slammed against the barrier, fists pounding uselessly against its surface. Rage consumed him, grief drowned him. His scream shook with agony as he called out the name of the fallen. Dora Drea. It had been her. Her head now lay at the masked man's feet. Theodore's fists continued to hammer the unbreakable wall, knuckles bloodied, his voice cracked, broken beyond repair, as he demanded the killer face him directly. The laughter came to a sudden halt. The masked man slowly lifted his hands to his face and removed the mask. The figure beneath beneath was no ordinary madman. He revealed himself as Draniv, eyes burning with twisted pride, voice filled with venomous indignation. He declared his name as if it were meant to inspire awe, as if he considered himself reborn, powerful, unstoppable. Across the barrier, Theodore stood unflinching. His voice had challenged the figure. He had called him what others dared not, a coward, hiding behind his magic. But before he could even finish the thought, the world shifted around him. Draniv blinked, disappeared, then reappeared in front of Theodore in the span of a breath. One moment, he was standing behind the barrier. The next, he was yanked through it effortlessly. Theodore twisted mid-flight, his instincts kicking in. He landed on his feet in a fluid, acrobatic motion, but the fury in his eyes burned hotter than ever. Without pause, he launched himself toward Draniv, a roar erupting from his throat. His leg swung upward, crashing down in a brutal heel kick aimed at Draniv's shoulder. The impact exploded across the platform. The stone floor cracked and erupted in dust. For a moment, silence fell. A cheer erupted from the students watching, voices full of hope, disbelief, and desperate excitement. Some exclaimed that even a professor would have struggled to block a strike like that. But then, from within the dust cloud came a scream. Not Draniv's, it was Theodore's voice, twisted in agony. As the dust settled, the truth revealed itself in grotesque detail. The platform had shattered beneath the force, but so had Theodore's leg. Bone jutted out through torn flesh. The lower half of his calf mangled and twisted in unnatural directions. Draniv stood above him, unharmed. A shadow passed over Theodore's face as Draniv raised his foot and brought it down, directly onto his skull. Theodore's head was pinned to the ground under the crushing pressure. Draniv stared down with amusement, his twisted smirk never fading. He mocked Theodore for his effort, for his challenge, for daring to believe he could make a difference. Then, almost casually, he raised his hand and snapped his fingers. In an instant, the air ignited. A terrible, gurgling scream tore through the courtyard as Theodore's body erupted into flame, crimson, unnatural, and searing. His limbs flailed for a brief moment before the fire consumed them, and then, as quickly as it had started, Draniv snapped again. The flames vanished. What lay on the shattered platform was no longer recognizable as human, just a blackened, smoldering corpse curled into itself, the charred remnants of what had once been Theodore. Draniv stood tall amidst the wreckage, his voice booming with twisted satisfaction as he gestured toward the mangled body. With a chilling grin on his face, he assured the horrified crowd that Theodore was still alive. A deafening silence gripped the arena. No one dared move. With theatrical flair, Draniv straightened his posture and announced the arrival of the main event. At his call, the frozen manhwa beasts that had been stationed nearby stirred as if waking from slumber. A slow, sinister procession began. From the looming bell tower, a line of hooded, robed figures emerged. Among the prisoners was Ferrith. His usually confident expression was now hollowed by pain and exhaustion. And then, Tessia. Elijah's mind stopped. His thoughts went silent. As Tessia was dragged out by her hair, her face bloodied, her garments torn and disheveled, something inside him broke. He staggered toward the barrier that separated them, his palms pressed hard against the invisible wall. Across the field, Claire was clinging tightly to Curtis. Her hand was clasped over his mouth, trembling, as tears streamed down her face, blurring her vision. She was pleading silently, her body shaking, begging him not to move. But Curtis couldn't hold it in. His rage exploded as he slammed his fist against the barrier with enough force to crack bone. He was shaking, his face contorted in fury and anguish. He screamed into the void, swearing vengeance, vowing to kill Draniv. Claire tightened her grip on him, sobbing. She begged him not to go, not to throw himself into the fire the way Theodore had. But Curtis couldn't listen. He shouted back at her, demanding how they could just stand there and watch while their friends were tortured. How could they wait? What did waiting achieve while Theodore burned and Ferrith bled? Then Kathleen stepped forward. Without a word, she struck him, an open-handed slap across the face that silenced even the thunder of his voice. Her own tears fell as she stared at her brother, her voice cracking with emotion as she reminded him of what truly mattered. They needed a plan. They needed to protect everyone, not lose themselves in blind fury. They couldn't afford to lose him, too. The sting of her words landed deeper than the slap. Shaken, Curtis could only nod. Meanwhile, Elijah remained frozen, watching Tessia in horror. His thoughts churned. She wasn't even supposed to be at the academy, so why was she here? Why was she in chains, bloodied, suffering? Draniv, with arms spread wide in a theatrical gesture, he introduced himself as their savior, a self-proclaimed liberator from a distant, merciless land. His voice rang with smug authority as he proclaimed that he had come to save them, though not out of compassion. No, his words dripped with disdain as he described his homeland, a place where the weak were discarded without a second thought. The students and onlookers, he called them the elite, were nothing in his eyes. In that cruel world he spoke of, their bloodlines and prestige amounted to garbage. His final words struck like lashes, delivered with cold staccato. They were trash, unworthy of survival in the world to come unless they earned it. Then came the promise. He had not come to destroy them, but to prepare them. He claimed that a chosen few would be shaped and trained for service when his lord rose to power. Those who proved themselves themselves would be granted a place in the new kingdom. The rest will be discarded. Confusion rippled through the captives. The disbelief on their faces showed they could hardly process what they were hearing. Draniv turned once again to the crowd, declaring that those present were the honored pawns of a new era. His voice darkened with excitement as he summoned Lukaya, a demonstration of the power his lord had granted. For a moment, the name was unfamiliar, but then the truth crashed down like a hammer. The hooded figure dragging Tessia stepped forward. Her battered face and torn clothes made her nearly unrecognizable, but the tormentor holding her by the hair could not be mistaken. It was Lucas Wykes. The sight of him, grinning in triumph, drove a bolt of rage through the hearts of those watching. He reveled in his betrayal, mocking the so-called defenders and protectors of the continent. Even the elite of the disciplinary committee had failed. Even Tessia, the elf princess many had admired, lay humiliated at his feet. Elijah's fury surged beyond control. All reason and restraint shattered the moment Lucas, still gripping Tessia, leaned in close to her. He ran his tongue up her neck, slow and deliberate, his eyes locked with Elijah's in sadistic amusement. Elijah's vision began to burn red, a haze of rage clouding his thoughts until his mind began to slip into numbness. Deep within, something stirred. An echo, a whisper that pulsed with hatred. It wasn't his own voice, but it echoed loud and clear in his head. The air shifted. On the platform above, Draniv, once smug and composed, now wore a face twisted with unexpected fear. Elijah wasn't in control anymore. His own body moved with frightening calmness, while the voice inside grew louder, more insistent, more violent. Suddenly, jagged black spikes tore through the earth around him, lashing out in every direction. Some of the surrounding students, too slow to react, were injured in the sudden eruption of dark magic. Elijah's conscious thoughts tried to recoil in horror. He hadn't meant to hurt them, but his body didn't slow down. His eyes were locked on Lucas Wykes, and his rage had already chosen its target. The barrier that separated them sizzled and dissolved under the dark plasma now enveloping Elijah's hand. He hadn't even tried. The sheer presence of whatever had taken hold of him melted it away. Then chaos. Dozens of mana beasts leapt from every direction, summoned to protect their masters, but they never reached him. One effortless motion of Elijah's arm, and again the ground erupted. Black spikes burst upward, impaling the beasts mid-air, stopping them like broken puppets before they could land a single blow. The robed figures, still holding the prisoner, suddenly hesitated. They released their captives and prepared to rush Elijah in unison, yet before they could move, Draniv stopped them. Whatever he saw in Elijah, it terrified him enough to abandon offense entirely. But inside Elijah's body, a storm was building. A searing pain tore through him. His body tensed, his muscles locked, and he could feel the cracks beginning to form. He was reaching his limit and fast. Still, even through the pain and the unraveling, his mind remained fixated on one thing: Lucas. If this force would grant him anything before it collapsed his body, it had to be that. Just once, he wanted to strike him. His hand lifted, and with a flash, a long black spike ripped through the air, heading straight for Lucas. It didn't end him. Not yet, but it struck with such force that Lucas tumbled backward. Elijah's body trembled, his breath growing shallow as the weight of exhaustion crushed him. Blood loss, pain, and sheer fatigue blurred the edges of his vision, and a cold numbness crept into his limbs. One last strike, one last effort, but he had nothing left to give. Draniv caught him as he slipped into unconsciousness. The world around Elijah blurred. In that final heartbeat before the darkness took him, he wished Arthur were there. Meanwhile, Claire Bladeheart stood paralyzed. Internally, her thoughts raged louder than any battle cry. The principles of her lineage, humility, loyalty, resoluteness, and courage, echoed in her mind like an oath long broken. These had been the sacred tenets of the Bladeheart family, instilled in her before she was even old enough to wield a wooden sword. As a child, she had believed she could live by them, no matter the cost. But reality had proven her wrong. The barrier had shattered, somehow through Elijah's unknown magic, and a surge of hope washed over her. This was the moment, the chance they had all waited for. Yet her body refused to move. She felt it then. Not just helplessness, but self-contempt. Her heart urged her forward, but her limbs remained locked in fear. From the crowd, a group of professors surged forward, led by Grenier, a burly mage whose staff pulsed with radiant energy. He moved despite his injuries, ignoring the blood seeping from his side. By his side was Professor Glory, her expression grim but determined. Watching them push toward the shattered barrier, Claire's heart twisted. They had no real chance. Surely they knew that. And yet they marched, heads high, into almost certain death. Was it duty driving them or pride? Was this what courage looked like? Or was it simply foolishness dressed in valor? Conflicted, Claire whispered the truth she couldn't admit aloud. It still felt hopeless. Beside her, Curtis looked at her, waiting. She didn't need to hear the question. She could see it in his eyes. Leadership, guidance, direction. But she had none to offer. Clive too looked her way, seeking confirmation. A spark, a plan, a reason to believe. Claire stumbled back, overwhelmed by the weight of expectation. Curtis, ever composed, had looked to her for guidance. As the leader of the disciplinary committee. They were ready to follow her lead into battle. But inside, Claire was crumbling. Fear clawed at her chest. Why couldn't they just let the professors handle it? Why did they, the students, have to throw their lives away? Around her, chaos loomed like a living storm. Yet her eyes fixated on the professors marching toward the breach in the barrier. A surreal scene, one that mirrored the bedtime stories her mother used to tell. They moved like legendary heroes, undaunted, resolute. The burly battle mage from last semester led the charge. Close behind him walked the spell formations professor, and then there was Professor Glory. She met Claire's eyes briefly, giving her a solemn nod, then pulled a second sword from her dimension ring. That single gesture sent shivers down Claire's spine. No words had been exchanged, yet everything was said. The Bladeheart creed screamed in her mind. Humility, loyalty, resoluteness, courage. Words that once felt like ceremony now dug into her soul. Frustration boiled within her, for her lack of resolve, for her hesitation, for being scared. Shame followed close behind. A true Bladeheart would fight for her academy, so why was she faltering? But hesitation died in the fire of duty. Something shifted in Claire. She turned to the frightened crowd behind her, her voice rising above the turmoil. Those too injured or too scared, she ordered them to stay back. There was no shame in fear, but there was honor in courage. For the rest, there was no turning back. She unsheathed her blade, its steel glinting with purpose. They would fight for Xyrus. Meanwhile, far from her conflicted resolve, Dreniv remained a picture of chilling composure. His voice, detached and unfeeling, sliced through the air as he informed Lucas of a change in plans. He would be leaving first, leaving Lucas behind to deal with the approaching resistance. And with cold finality, Dreniv issued one more command to dispose of the limp, broken figure of Tessia. Around Tessia, several robed men stood, yelling at her lifeless body to rise, as if the sound of their rage could drag her back from unconsciousness. But Tessia remained motionless. Lucas, full of arrogant indignation, began to protest, only to falter mid-sentence. His words caught in his throat as a sudden crushing force overcame him. His eyes widened in terror, and he fell to his knees. Dreniv's voice shifted, no longer the polite, manipulative tone he had used before. Dreniv reminded Lucas that he was nothing more than a tool. His obedience was not optional, and any hint of insubordination would be met with consequences. The weight of those words forced Lucas into silence as he clawed weakly at his chest, trying to regain control over his body and breath. Nearby, one of the robed mages signaled that the preparations were complete. The anvil pulsed with an ominous glow. Dreniv warned Lucas not to disappoint him. With a disdainful snort, he turned his back and strode toward the portal. Professor Grenier was the first to sense that something was terribly wrong. He shouted a warning and charged forward. 3 other professors followed, surging toward the gap in the barrier with weapons drawn and spells ready. But Lucas, though still showing signs of strain, stepped forward, his face now devoid of fear. With a sinister calm, he raised one arm, summoning a towering column of fire. The flames erupted like a geyser, thick and roaring, blocking the professor's path. With his other hand, he conjured another. Twin dragons of pure fire twisted into existence, their blazing forms rushing in unison to devour everything in their path. Professor Grenier acted swiftly. With a thunderous stomp of his staff against the ground, he summoned a massive earthen beast from the cracked floor. The creature surged upward, formed from jagged stone and ancient soil, its maw open wide. One of the fire dragons vanished into its gaping mouth, snuffed out as if it had never existed. Beside him, another professor drew his wand with precision and summoned a torrent of water. The spell collided with the remaining flame dragon in a deafening explosion, steam and heat blasting outward in every direction. Under the shattered dome of the academy, the air crackled with hostility as Professor Glory advanced, her twin swords gleaming with imbued mana. Her voice rang out like a war horn, condemning Lucas for his treachery, an act of betrayal that defied the very principles of their institution. But Lucas, now far removed from the boy he once was, let loose a roar of defiance. Just as Professor Glory neared, jaws as wide as a wagon wheel snapped toward her. A mana beast summoned to intercept lunged with primal hunger. Reacting instinctively, Glory twisted her body midair and rolled under the beast's attack. In a seamless motion, she swung her sword upward and cleaved through the creature's neck, severing its head with a single decisive blow. Landing on her feet, she pressed forward, her voice like thunder in the chaos, demanding more from her opponent, daring him to try harder. But Lucas would not face her alone. Several robed men, sensing his vulnerability, rushed to his aid, charging toward Professor Glory in unison. Her eyes narrowed as she assessed the situation. She knew she couldn't take them all at once. It was too much, even for her. Before the enemies could strike, the sky itself answered. From above, a deadly storm of fire, wind, and ice rained down on the advancing cultists. Magical bursts tore through their ranks as the disciplinary committee burst onto the battlefield, led by Curtis, mounted on Grotter. Claire, resolute and burning with fury, called out orders to secure the hostages and support the professors. Professor Glory turned incredulous at their intervention. Her concern for their safety clashed with her gratitude, but Claire, undeterred, drove her sword through an approaching beast. Her message was clear. They would not stand aside. This battle belonged to all of them. Professor Glory relented, shouting for them to be careful. Claire's eyes swept across the battlefield, her gaze locking onto a figure emerging through the chaos. A robed man striding with calculated purpose toward the mana beasts. The moment her eyes landed on him, a surge of fury boiled within her. She knew that face beneath the hood. Her jaw tightened, and her grip on her weapon grew ironclad. It was Kai. Rage overwhelmed reason as Claire launched forward, mana surging into her weapon with every step. Her lips moved rapidly, reciting a chant under her breath. Flames ignited around her blade, forming a swirling cone of fire that blazed with lethal intent. The ground responded violently. Earthen spears shot up to intercept her, but she twisted and dodged, never slowing, her focus locked entirely on her target. Leaping into the air, Claire released a burst of fire, cutting through the smoke. From within the flames, robbed mages retaliated, water spells erupting to meet her assault. Steam hissed as the opposing elements clashed, but Kai wasn't done. Between the smoke and embers, metallic magic snapped through the air. Thin, gleaming wires lashed out. Before Claire could react, they coiled around her wrists and ankles, wrapping her mid-air, suspending her in a deadly bind. Her body strained against the restraints, eyes blazing with betrayal as she demanded how Kai could do this. To them, to Theo, to Dora Drea. Then, without warning, an unseen force slammed into her, hurling her backward and ripping the breath from her lungs. In that instant, the battlefield fell silent. Her thoughts spiraled. She couldn't understand. Why wasn't anyone stopping Kai? Why were the others running toward her when the real threat was walking away? Then the pain registered. Looking down, she saw it, a jagged stone spike jutting from her stomach. Her sword slipped from her hand as trembling fingers reached down, brushing the blood now soaking her armor. The silence shattered. Screams and shouts erupted around her, the battlefield roaring back to life. Familiar voices, terrified ones desperately calling her name, yet all of it felt distant, fading. And then the sky roared. A sound tore through the heavens, primordial and raw, more a force of nature than a voice. A blood-curdling roar so deep and thunderous it shook the ground beneath the fighters' feet. Everyone froze. Fear spread like wildfire through enemy and ally alike. Even Lucas, moments ago emboldened, now stood rooted. Something unseen had clawed into his chest. Then it appeared, a dragon. Its arrival wasn't just seen, it was felt, its presence eclipsing everything else. But it wasn't the beast alone that drew all eyes. Beneath it walked a boy. He moved like a storm barely contained. It was Arthur. And in that moment, as Claire's vision darkened and her body began to give in, one final thought flickered in her mind, not of the wound, not of defeat, but of what would come next. Her only regret was simple and cruel. She would not live long enough to see the look of utter defeat carved into Lucas's face. Destruction had swallowed the once proud grounds of Xyrus Academy. Blood stained the marble tiles, pooling beneath lifeless bodies of students and professors alike. Those once hailed as elite, now reduced to corpses. Among the carnage, Glory struggled to her feet, battered and broken. Above it all, Lucas stood amidst the chaos like a mad king claiming dominion over ruin. Within his mind, calculation surged. His cognitive processing sharpened unnaturally, reflexes heightened beyond mortal means. Dreneve's elixir coursed through his veins, granting him a vast, seemingly endless reservoir of mana. He believed himself transcendent, a god among insects. The so-called elites had fallen like children before him, and yet, in the depths of his euphoria, something clawed at his insides. An icy grip twisted within him, unnatural and cold, as if his very core protested the abomination he had become. But Lucas only laughed, consumed by his delusion, deaf to the warnings of his own body. As he turned, his eyes met a new arrival, Arthur Leywin. A dragon at his side, radiating primal power, had followed him into the war zone. Lucas, unshaken by the beast's presence, barked with wild amusement. But despite the venom in his expression, Arthur did not react. He didn't even look at Lucas. Not once had his gaze wavered in Lucas's direction. Arthur walked past the self-proclaimed demigod without pause, without acknowledgement, as if Lucas Wykes didn't exist, and that indifference was a blade sharper than any sword. For Lucas, the insult was unbearable. He seethed with fury. In his mind, Arthur should have trembled, should have begged, yet the boy walked calmly through a battlefield of death, not sparing a glance for the chaos or for Lucas's madness. His silence, more deafening than any insult, ignited a storm inside the mad mage. Around them, the cloaked soldiers who had followed Lucas recoiled. Their bravado crumbled beneath the presence of the beast beside Arthur. Whispers of fear broke among them as realization set in. What stood before them was no illusion, no summon. It was a dragon, and their bodies, frozen in terror, refused to obey even the instinct to flee. Unbothered Shattered by their fear, Arthur moved to the one person who still mattered, Tessia Erlith. The elf princess lay unconscious, fragile against the backdrop of devastation. He knelt beside her, brushing away strands of bloodied hair, searching for signs of life. Sylvie leaned in close, her massive form careful, eyes gentle for only this moment. A faint pulse. Tessia had been drugged, likely to suppress her consciousness, but aside from some bruises and superficial injuries, she was alive. But peace never lingered long in a place soaked in blood. From behind, Lucas's voice rang out again, laced with mockery and venom. He reveled in the fact that Tessia had cried for Arthur, claimed he had spared her only at Dreneve's command. Yet even that twisted restraint was beginning to crumble beneath Lucas's fractured mind. The thought of breaking Arthur, not through combat, but through helplessness, drove him further toward the edge. He imagined Arthur breaking, shattered, helpless, pinned down beneath the weight of loss and failure. But Sylvie had heard enough. With a roar that ripped through the very foundations of Xyrus Academy, Sylvie answered. But Arthur didn't. His gaze never shifted from Tessia, unwavering and calm, as if Lucas didn't exist. That disregard stung more than any insult. Inside, Lucas burned with fury. The silence mocked him, made him feel insignificant, discarded like trash before royalty. But just as he prepared to shout again, to force a response from the boy he so hated, the earth beneath Arthur groaned. Then it broke. Without warning, the ground cracked and folded inward as though the world itself recoiled in fear. Lucas stumbled as his footing vanished, and something ancient and primal crawled up his spine, a pressure that coiled around his chest and refused to let go. The fear it birthed within him dwarfed the reverence he had ever felt for any professor, any mage, even his own brother. It was as if a predator had stepped out of the abyss, and Lucas, for all his power, was nothing more than prey. Bloodlust poured from Arthur's very presence, tangible, heavy, and oppressive. His eyes, devoid of mercy or hesitation, locked onto Lucas. To Arthur, Lucas was no longer a threat. He was a nuisance, a wasp that had dared to sting one too many times. Fear surged through Lucas's limbs. His magic, his lineage, none of it mattered. His body froze under that invisible weight, the sheer will pressing down on him like chains forged in death itself. Panic clawed at his throat, rationality slipping as his instincts screamed to flee. From beneath him, shadows burst forth like living things, wrapping around his legs and yanking him down. His breath caught, the cold embrace of darkness gripped tighter, dragging him toward a fate he could no longer comprehend. He couldn't understand it. His mana, his status, his superiority, how could it mean so little? How could Arthur, someone he had always viewed as a mere insect, command such terror? It wasn't power, it was experience. It was the weight of battles survived, of lives taken, of wars waged alone, and that presence now towered over Lucas like a god of wrath. In desperation, Lucas began to retreat. With a trembling voice, he unleashed a spell, Hell's Rain. Fiery spheres ignited around him, dozens of them forming a protective ring as they hovered in the air. They swelled in size with each heartbeat, glowing red at first, then turning an eerie blue as he infused them with more refined mana. From behind, Sylvie's voice rang out, worried and alert, but Arthur remained composed. Cold resolve filled him. He could have simply stood back, let Lucas be consumed by his own reckless magic, but such an end would be far too kind for what Lucas had done. Arthur wouldn't allow him the mercy of dying by his own hands. With a controlled breath, Arthur invoked the next stage of his power. His vision dulled into monochrome as Dragon's Awakening. Second phase took hold. He summoned water mana, the very air beginning to crystallize. A curtain of white flame, absolute zero, exploded into existence around Arthur as Lucas's flaming bombardment crashed down. The spheres struck, but none breached Arthur's frost barrier. The flames fizzled into steam against the wave of cold, powerless to pierce through. Lucas stood paralyzed, horrified. His lips trembled as he tried to make sense of the impossible. Ice magic. Arthur had suddenly mastered ice attribute mana. Still reeling, Lucas tried to retaliate, summoning every last shred of his remaining mana. His right hand glowed with unstable power, pulsing violently as he attempted another advanced spell, Creation Form. Mana condensed into a weapon, forming a spear of blue fire, dangerously volatile and humming with destructive force. Arthur responded without hesitation. With precision, he began casting two spells simultaneously, lightning in one hand, ice in the other. As Lucas hurled his spear, Arthur caught its shaft mid-air with his left hand. The impact forced him back a step. Then Arthur retaliated. From his right hand, a concentrated arc of black lightning surged forward. The spell screeched through the air like a banshee's cry before slamming directly into Lucas's arm. The energy severed it clean from his body. Lucas was thrown backward, the charred remains of his arm trailing behind him. A shrill, agonizing scream tore from his lungs as he hit the ground. Arthur stepped forward slowly as Lucas lay collapsed before him, clawing at the empty space where his arm had once been, blood trailing down his side. died. His eyes widened in terror as he tried to comprehend what he was witnessing. The lightning crackling around Arthur's arm, the unshakable calm in his expression. Lucas's mind reeled. A quadra elemental. The thought was incomprehensible, but reality gave him no reprieve. Without hesitation, Arthur seized Lucas's remaining arm. The flames swirling around his own hand changed, taking on a deadly chill. Frost formed at the point of contact, racing down Lucas's flesh and into the bone. The limb froze completely, and in one crushing motion, Arthur shattered it. Shards of flesh and ice exploded into the air, falling like broken glass. Lucas stared, unblinking, at the scattered remnants of his arm. Then, like a marionette with its strings cut, his body slumped onto the ground. He sputtered, attempting to protest, but the words died in his throat as he struggled to breathe. Arthur stepped onto Lucas's leg, his foot laden with crushing gravitational force. In a voice cold and unyielding, he uttered a single command: downforce. The sound was immediate, a sharp, grotesque snap as the bone collapsed beneath the pressure. Blood sprayed outward in a messy arc, soaking into the shattered floor beneath them. Lucas screamed, choking on blood, his voice hoarse and ragged. With his opponent pinned and helpless, Arthur leaned in, seeking the truth buried behind the pain. He demanded answers. Draneeb's name had been mentioned, and Arthur wanted clarity, but Lucas's gaze had changed. The light in his eyes had shifted from fear to spite. Lucas's face twisted into a manic grin as he wheezed through broken breaths, taunting Arthur with what little strength he had left. Then, before he could finish, another sharp impact resounded across the battlefield. Arthur brought his weight down again, this time on the other leg. Arthur's decision loomed heavier than the storm clouds gathering above. He knew the world would change. It always did, and though he had no control over that tide, there were still things he could control. He stepped forward, placing his foot between what remained of Lucas's mutilated legs, on the only part of the wretched man's body that hadn't yet been destroyed. Lucas, weak and trembling, stammered in terror. Without hesitation, Arthur locked eyes with him and delivered his final judgment, that his suffering would haunt him until his next life. The air trembled as mana surged through Arthur's leg. Then, with one brutal motion, his foot came crashing down. A sickening cascade of noises tore through the stillness. The final scream that escaped Lucas's throat was nothing short of animalistic, but even with the villain broken beneath him, Arthur didn't feel triumph. There were no cheers, no applause. Instead, the eyes of every student, every professor stared at him with something else, something colder: fear. The fear once reserved for Lucas had now shifted to Arthur. It had been years since Arthur had seen such looks. Back then, he'd welcomed them, even basked in the intimidation his strength inspired. But now, it felt like a noose tightening around his neck, a burden he carried alone. The weight of Dragon's awakening became too much to bear. Agonizing pain racked Arthur's body as the transformation forcibly unraveled. Glowing runes faded from his skin. His vision returned to normal, but his soul remained frayed. Before him, Lucas's final moments played out in broken fragments. Frothing at the mouth, eyes glazed over, he mumbled unintelligibly, slipping into unconsciousness. Arthur raised his hand, ready to end it completely. But fate had other plans. A sharp, piercing resonance cut through the silence, startling every soul on the field. The crimson barrier that had sealed off the school cracked, and then shattered completely. Descending from above, through the storm of broken light, came three figures. Arthur didn't need to see their faces to know. That kind of power could only belong to one group: the Lances. Lucas let out a strained, gurgled gasp, and a word slipped from his lips: brother. The air around Baron ignited with fury. His body trembled, clenched teeth grinding with helpless rage. The ground beneath him cracked and shuddered. Violent arcs of lightning danced across his frame as flames exploded outward. Before Arthur could process the word Lucas had uttered, a searing blast of condensed light slammed into his chest. The impact was blinding. It hurled Arthur through the air like a rag doll and sent him crashing into the bell tower. Half conscious, vision flickering between shadows and light, Arthur caught a blur of movement. A figure approached, the shape too indistinct to recognize. Before the figure could strike again, a sudden roar echoed. Unleashing a wave of blazing fire, Sylvie shot through the air like a comet. Arthur's mind screamed. She couldn't win this fight, not against Lances, but his thoughts were too slow, too distant to reach her in time. Sylvie, in her rage, flew straight at Baron and the other Lances. But just as she was about to attack, Varai intervened. With chilling precision, the lance encased Sylvie in a dome of thick, mana-reinforced ice. Sylvie hissed against the frozen prison, unable to burn through or break free. Arthur lay pinned, his strength drained, every breath a struggle. If only he could trigger his second phase again. The thought gnawed at him. Before Arthur could finish cursing his own luck, the very storm of lightning he had feared came hurtling toward him. Baron, eyes wild, face twisted in grief and rage, charged forward like judgment incarnate. But as he neared, Ulfred's voice cut through the storm. Ulfred's command halted the inevitable. He had seen enough. Baron's hand twitched as he turned to face his fellow Lance. Baron demanded justice, and to him, justice meant vengeance. Ulfred didn't flinch. He reminded Baron of the truth, that Arthur had saved everyone from Lucas's rampage. He reminded Baron that power didn't justify madness. But Baron wasn't swayed by words. His grief consumed him. In his mind, Arthur's death was the only closure he could accept. He turned his burning gaze back toward the rubble where Arthur lay. But before he could reach him, two coal-black knights, summoned stone constructs by Lance Ulfred, burst from the ground and seized his arms. The lightning that danced around Baron's body did nothing to deter their grip. Still, fury burned in his voice as he bellowed Ulfred's name, struggling against the knights that held him back. In an explosive burst of elemental wrath, Baron unleashed a shockwave infused with fire, obliterating the two summoned knights in an instant. The blast sent a cascade of debris across the ruined landscape, and even Lance Ulfred himself was forced to skid backward. With wrath unchained, Baron's hand transformed. Flattened fingers ignited with surging lightning, coalescing into a crackling spear of pure power. Raising the devastating lance high, he brought it down with lethal force meant to end Arthur then and there. Curtis and Kathleen, witnessing the attack, shouted in horror, their voices desperate but helpless in the face of Baron's strength. Death was moments away from claiming Arthur, but in that very moment, Lance Varay intervened. With a flick of her wrist, an impenetrable wall of ice surged between Arthur and Baron's wrath. The charged lance collided against the frosted barrier, sending sparks and steam into the air as elements clashed. Before Baron could react again, ice surged up from below, encasing his neck in sharp coffins of frozen mana, restraining him without drawing blood. Her eyes remained cold and impassive as she stepped forward. Varay made it clear, the judgment of Arthur and the dragon was not Baron's to make. That responsibility rested solely with the council. Her words cut deeper than any blade, reminding Baron of the order he swore to serve. Faced with the lance's authority, Baron eventually relented. With a breath laced with resentment, he gave a terse nod. Within the hour, Lance Ulfred's knights stood guard at the gates, vigilant and unmoving. A rapid response team from both the Adventurers Guild and Mages Guild arrived at the devastated academy, their urgency evident. Healers moved between wounded bodies, stabilizing those who clung to life and covering those who had already slipped away. Chaos reigned. Some families cried tears of relief upon finding their children alive, while others collapsed in anguish beside the bodies of the fallen, sobs of joy and heartbreak clashing in the air. Arthur, though alive, was not unscathed. His body, drained of mana and aching from the battle, was quickly tended to by medics. As he sat recovering amidst the fading battlefield, Lance Varay approached him. She asked if he required further medical care. Arthur shook his head as there was no grave injury, only mana depletion. Varay, holding a pair of gleaming mana-restricting cuffs in her hands, clasped them around Arthur's wrists. Though her tone remained neutral, there was a subtle edge of finality in her actions, as if warning him not to resist. Then, reaching into her robe, she retrieved an artifact and pressed it firmly against Arthur's chest. A surge of potent energy erupted from it. Glowing mana threads instantly wrapped around him, forming a complex magical seal that restrained not just his body, but his mana as well. Despite the suppressive force surrounding him, Arthur didn't protest. His attention shifted toward Sylvie, still encased in the icy dome conjured earlier by Varay. With a subtle wave of her hand, Varay's magic responded. The ice surrounding Sylvie cracked and splintered, melting away in seconds. The dragon, now free, stepped toward Arthur defensively. She refused to back down, despite being vastly outmatched. But Arthur, bound and powerless, spoke calmly to her. He reminded her of the futility in resistance. They had no chance of overcoming this. Not here. Not now. Sylvie's protest faded as she accepted the reality. Her body shimmered with light before shrinking back into her fox-like form. The transformation left Varay visibly surprised. Sylvie trotted to Arthur's side, her small form brushing gently against his leg as her worried gaze met his. Arthur responded with quiet reassurance, his gaze steady, uncertain of what lay ahead, but determined to stay strong for her. Using a magical link, Varay fastened Sylvie's form to Arthur's restraints. The two were now shackled together. Varay turned and instructed Arthur to follow. She led the way toward the Mage Guild's temporary camp, where they would await judgment from the council. Arthur complied without resistance, walking closely behind the lance. Around them, summoned knights and lances formed an unbreakable barrier. As Arthur followed them, the weight of judgment pressed down from every direction. The air outside was thick with whispers. Some spoke of murder, others named the victim. They weren't just repeating rumors, they were shaping a narrative. Arthur had slain a student, and not just any student, a Wykes, a noble. Even as some tried to argue that the Wykes boy had been part of a terrorist group, their voices were drowned beneath those clinging to prejudice, voicing disdain that a commoner like Arthur ever belonged in Xyrus. Amidst this tension, a familiar voice pierced through the haze of whispers. Arthur's head snapped around instinctively, his gaze locked onto his family, Reynold, Alice, and Ellie, standing behind the iron gate, their faces painted with a mix of relief and dread. Arthur turned to Lance Varay and, with controlled calm, asked for permission to speak with them. She met his gaze and gave a polite nod. But before Arthur could take a step forward, Lance Baron's voice lashed out, filled with contempt and fury. Yet before things escalated further, Ulfred, the elder eldest and wisest among them, intervened. He reminded Baron that emotions must not overshadow justice. Arthur had done what was necessary. That fact stood above personal vendettas. With permission granted and the tension momentarily tempered, Arthur moved toward his family. Standing just beyond the gate, Reynolds' voice trembled as he asked what had happened and why his son was restrained like a criminal. Arthur kept his voice light, assuring him it was all a misunderstanding. Alice clung to his words, asking again and again if it was truly nothing serious. Arthur forced a smile, the kind that barely reached his eyes. He told them not to worry, that he would be okay, and asked them to take care of one another until he returned. Alice wasn't ready to let go. She asked if there was anything they could do, her voice cracking beneath the weight of helplessness. Arthur looked away for a moment before promising that he'd be fine. He reminded them that he was their son, strong, capable, unbreakable. Just then, a sudden shimmer of light emanated from the ring worn by Lance Varay. It was the signal everyone had been waiting for. The Council of Dicathen had reached their decision. As the magic settled, a scroll materialized in Varay's hand. Arthur, still facing his family just beyond the iron gate, turned reluctantly. Lance Varay began to read the council's decree aloud. She addressed him formally, Arthur Leywin, son of Reynolds and Alice Leywin, as the council's verdict was laid bare. The charges were clear: excessive violence, questionable circumstances, and uncertainty surrounding the events that transpired. Because of this, Arthur's mana core was to be restrained, his title as a mage stripped, and his fate sealed, for now, with incarceration until further judgment could be passed. As Varay finished the last words, the scroll curled tightly back into itself. Then, for the first time during the reading, her eyes met Arthur's, and with that gaze, she sealed the council's judgment. It was official, effective immediately. The cold finality in Lance Varay's voice settled over the courtyard like a heavy fog, silencing the air with the weight of injustice. From behind the metal barrier, Alice cried out in disbelief, her voice raw and trembling. She couldn't understand. Her son, incarcerated? It had to be a mistake. Reynolds, steadier but equally shaken, tried to reason aloud, insisting that there must be an explanation. Their desperate voices were soon joined by others. Students Arthur had fought beside, instructors who had seen the chaos firsthand. Outcries echoed across the courtyard, rising into a wave of protest. Yet Varay stood unmoved, her eyes fixed forward, tuned out to the cacophony of outrage around her. Then a sharper voice rang out. Kathleen Glader strode forward with fury burning in her eyes. Her words lashed out, accusing the very authority that stood before them. She defended Arthur with unwavering conviction, claiming that without him, there would have been no one left for the Lances to rescue. But Varay did not flinch. She slowly unrolled the scroll in her hand, revealing the signatures that sealed the judgment. Among them were the names of Kathleen's own parents, King and Queen Glader, and beside theirs, the names of the Graysunders. The ruling powers of both kingdoms had agreed. Kathleen staggered back, stunned. Her disbelief turned to denial, but her brother, Curtis, moved to her side, gently pulling her away. Kathleen fell silent, her face flushed and her body trembling. Arthur, watching the scene unfold, felt the last threads of resistance within him give way to resignation. The decision had been unanimous, approved by the very leaders he thought would understand. With a heavy breath, Arthur gathered what dignity he had left and asked if he could speak with his family one last time. Varay responded with a curt nod. He turned and shuffled toward the fence. Arthur tried to ease the tension with a smile, his attempt to reassure his family falling flat under the weight of what none of them could fully grasp yet. His words were meant to comfort, but Alice, his mother, saw right through him. Her voice trembled as she confronted the truth he wouldn't speak. She asked him quietly if he even understood what was going to happen to him. Arthur couldn't look her in the eye. His gaze stayed fixed on her trembling hands, the very hands that had comforted him as a child, now powerless to protect him. Beside her stood Ellie, her small hands clenched into fists, face flushed red with fear. Her voice cracked as she begged for reassurance, pleading for this to be a joke. But Arthur knew it wasn't, and as he placed his hand gently on her head, ruffling her hair like he used to, the pain of time lost between them hit him harder than he expected. She had grown so quickly. He hadn't been there enough to see it. He whispered a promise, one he desperately wanted to keep, that he would come back, that this was temporary, that they would see him again. Reynolds stepped forward with solemn strength. He didn't offer empty words, just a promise of unwavering support. No matter what the world believed, no matter what judgments were passed, his family would stand by him. Reynolds urged him to come home. That was all that mattered now. Arthur turned away, blinking back the tears threatening to escape. He didn't want them to see him break. With a silent nod, he walked back toward the Lances, his heart heavier than ever. Nearby, Baron was addressing the others. He announced that he'd be taking a detour to his family's estate, carrying with him the body of his brother, Lucas, wrapped in cloth. Ulfred seemed ready to protest, perhaps expecting the body to be delivered to the council for further investigation, but Vare silenced him with a subtle wave of her hand. Baron's glare at Arthur was sharp and venomous, but there was no further confrontation. With a powerful burst of mana, Baron took to the skies, vanishing into the clouds with his brother's corpse. Then Ulfred raised his hand and summoned a massive stone knight from the ground. The golem lifted Arthur up into the air, separating him from Sylvie. Their departure was silent. Arthur's eyes remained fixed on Xyrus Academy, shrinking in the distance below. It was more than just a school, it had been a second home, a place of growth, struggle, and fleeting peace. As the floating city faded from view, so too did the remnants of his life as an ordinary student. They flew wordlessly across the sky, the wind drowning out every attempt he might have made to speak, or maybe no one was listening. Meanwhile, Baron Wykes descended from the skies and landed at the entrance of the Wykes Manor. In his arms, he carried the wrapped corpse of his younger brother, Lucas. His face remained stoic, his steps heavy with burden. The sudden arrival startled the household staff. None had expected him, let alone in such a grim state. As he walked past them, their bows and greetings were met with silence. One of the housekeepers approached, startled yet respectful, only to freeze as her eyes caught the body cradled in his arms. Shock drained the color from her face, but before she could ask further, Baron's cold voice ordered her to summon his father immediately. Moments later, Baron stood face to face with Otis Veher Wykes, the head of the Wykes household. The mood was grim, and then Baron delivered the words that would shatter the night. Lucas was dead. Otis's face contorted in fury, his fists clenched, and rage twisted every line of his face. He slammed his fist onto the nearby table, the wood cracking under the force. Lucas's death wasn't just a loss to him, it was humiliation, a disgrace to the Wykes name. Otis's anger boiled over as he ranted about the resources he had poured into his son, every elite tutor, rare beast core, and elixir spent to shape Lucas into a worthy heir. All wasted. His frustration was not just over the death, but over the shame that accompanied it. Then his fury turned on Baron. Otis accused him of failing, not only to protect the Wykes name, but of bringing home the shameful remains of his brother. The presence of Lucas's corpse to Otis was a stain on the manor, a reminder of failure. He lifted his hand to strike Baron, but the blow never landed. Baron caught his father's hand mid-air. His eyes were hard, unflinching. This was not a boy defying his father. This was a lance of Dicathen asserting his authority. He reminded Otis of that fact. He was not just a Wykes. He was a lance, a protector of the continent. Otis sneered, bitterness replacing fury. In his eyes, Baron's status as a lance was not earned. It was a privilege handed to him by bloodline. But he pulled himself back, straightened his posture, and with a calmer tone, demanded to know the truth. Baron, unwavering, reported the events. Witness accounts confirmed that Lucas had aligned himself with a group of cultists, led by a figure named Draneve. He had terrorized Xyrus Academy alongside them. The one who ended Lucas's life did so swiftly and without mercy. Otis saw an opportunity here, one that needed to be seized before truth or reason had the chance to catch up. With a thoughtful hum, Otis made up his mind. He called out sharply for his assistant. A few seconds later, the heavy door creaked open, and Adeline, his young but efficient aide, stepped in. Otis didn't waste time. He instructed her to prepare an urgent message to the council. Without a word, Adeline drew a sheet of parchment and uncapped her ink. Her hand hovered, ready to transcribe. Otis began dictating, a tale drenched in manipulation and feigned grief. He framed the attack on Xyrus as an unforgettable tragedy, one in which his own son, Lucas Wykes, had tragically become a victim, not a perpetrator. He emphasized that Lucas, under the influence of the powerful Draneve, had no choice in his actions. According to Otis, any resistance would have meant instant death for his son. He painted Lucas as a brave child caught in a storm too large for him to withstand, a pawn who was forced into villainy. Then, with calculated sorrow, he decried the manner of Lucas's death, labeling it as an act of merciless brutality at the hands of a rogue. He called Arthur Leywin lawless, a blackguard unfit to remain in society. The letter swelled with righteous indignation and grief, calling not for understanding, but for vengeance masked as justice. He closed the message with a statement that they were preparing a private funeral for Lucas, and expressed hope that the council would reach a fair and decisive conclusion. As Otis finished, he turned to Baron, who had stood silently by through it all. Otis asked if his version of events was acceptable. Baron, though clearly burdened by the complexity of the situation, paused and gave a small nod. Adeline, never questioning, bowed politely. With a soft voice, she offered her condolences and promised to deliver the message without delay. She exited with practiced grace, leaving father and son alone in the room once more. Otis, without missing a beat, sat back down and resumed his work. When Baron hesitantly brought up the arrangements for Lucas's funeral, Otis dismissed him coldly, not even lifting his gaze. He ordered that Adeline take care of it and told Baron to leave. Baron did not protest. He lowered his head in silent obedience and left left the study. While political narratives were being sculpted behind closed doors, far away and unaware of the storm forming around his name, Arthur soared through the skies with the lances. Bound in magical restraints, he was being escorted like a prisoner rather than a hero. The skies around them were endless, painted with soft hues of dusk. Arthur, flying alongside the stern faces of the lances, finally spoke up, asking how far they were from their destination. Ulfred replied that it wasn't far now. Arthur, his hands weighted by the cuffs, pointed out that the restraints were unnecessary. He wasn't foolish enough to try escaping midair, especially not from 2 lances of Dicathen. Yet his reasoning was dismissed. Ulfred calmly explained that it wasn't about suspicion, it was about precaution. Flying over the beast glades came with its own dangers, and Arthur, even unintentionally, could cause complications they couldn't afford. Arthur questioned how even a lance, one of the continent's most powerful protectors, could find certain mana beasts difficult to handle. Ulfred didn't take offense. Instead, he responded with a tone both measured and grim, reminding Arthur that lances, while formidable, were still mortals. The beast glades were unpredictable, harboring ancient and unknown threats even the strongest couldn't anticipate. Ulfred's gaze hardened slightly, hinting at the strange occurrences that had been plaguing the continent lately. He shook his head and chuckled at himself, remarking that he was sharing too much with someone still just a boy. Arthur, sharp as ever, remarked dryly on being called a little kid, reminding Ulfred that he was, in fact, a prisoner. The tension eased slightly when Ulfred let out a soft laugh, admitting that both could be true. Arthur, never one to let an opportunity slip, pointed out that compared to the stiff and aloof presence of the other lances, he probably made for better company. Ulfred agreed with a smile, admitting that those two weren't exactly conversationalists. Then, with a tone more serious, Ulfred asked Arthur how he had become such a capable mage at such a young age. Arthur responded carefully, noting that Ulfred had never even seen him fight, but Ulfred wasn't speaking blindly. He had already heard stories, accounts from Baron regarding Lucas, as well as from students who had witnessed the chaos. The tales had been enough to form a reputation. Arthur's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice tinged with irony as he pondered what exactly those people had said, especially considering that Ulfred was still escorting him as a prisoner. Ulfred acknowledged the peculiarity of their situation. The conversation drifted into silence, and while Ulfred came off as friendly, Arthur noted how carefully he guarded his words, like someone well aware of the stakes at hand. Their flight came to an abrupt stop when Vare, flying ahead, suddenly halted midair. Raising her hand slightly, she activated her ice spell. The very sky itself seemed to part, an illusion falling away as she conjured a staircase of gleaming ice that spiraled up into a structure suspended in the clouds. Arthur could only stare in awe, his mouth slightly open at the sight. Ulfred noticed his reaction and smirked knowingly. Before them stood the entrance to the floating fortress of the council, the ruling seat of Dicathen, their destination. It appeared that the more perceptive mana beast had sensed the presence of the floating structure. With calm urgency, he urged that they proceed quickly to avoid attracting unwanted attention. Vare gave only a curt nod in response, her focus fixed ahead. Arthur was gently lowered to the ground at the base of a towering flight of stairs. As soon as his feet touched the cold stone, the stone construct crumbled into a cascade of sand and reformed itself into a flowing cape fastening neatly onto Ulfred's back. It was a dwarven tradition to always carry a portion of their earthborn magic with them, especially now, in a place where they could not draw from the castle walls or floor. Vare stepped ahead without a word, taking the lead up the vast staircase. Ulfred and Arthur followed closely behind, their heavy footsteps echoing against the stone steps. As they climbed, a sliver of light broke through a hidden seam in the stone wall, revealing a corridor bathed in ethereal illumination. Arthur's eyes adjusted to the brightness, slowly revealing the grandeur of what lay ahead. The hallway stretched far into the distance, arched high above like a cathedral ceiling. Every visible surface was intricately carved with ancient, glowing runes. Strange, mesmerizing designs that didn't seem decorative, but sacred. It felt less like a hallway and more like a memorial to forgotten souls. In a hushed tone, Ulfred leaned close enough for Arthur to hear without turning. He warned the boy not to speak casually anymore, not to the lances, and especially not within the castle walls. Arthur said nothing, but inside something stirred. The atmosphere, the power, the silence, the isolation, it all reminded him of the citadels from his past life. Beautiful, majestic, but haunted by emptiness and a deep, aching loneliness. They walked in silence until Vare finally stopped beside a door that looked no different from any other. Without hesitation, she knocked firmly until the door swung open, revealing a sparse chamber. At the back stood a long, rectangular table, behind which sat the 6 members of the Council of Dicathen. Vare and Ulfred both bowed deeply, announcing Arthur's presence before the council. Arthur mirrored their gesture, showing the respect demanded of the moment. Yet as he straightened, a sharp voice cut through the air. King Dossid Dacid Greysunder sneered at Arthur's formality. To him, a simple bow wasn't enough. His harsh words condemned Arthur's perceived arrogance, declaring that someone of his standing should kneel before the council, not stand alongside the lances. Arthur's pride bristled, his mouth twitching with the urge to reply, but before any words could escape, his eyes met those of King Alduin Erlith. The Elven King gave a subtle shake of the head, measured and firm. Arthur lowered his head and admitted his ignorance of courtly customs, apologizing for any unintended disrespect. King Blaine Glader, seated among the high seats, waved off the need for formalities. He acknowledged the long journey they had endured, and, in a calm but commanding tone, instructed the lance to release Arthur from his cuffs so the hearing could begin. With a flick of her fingers, the magical bindings around Arthur's wrists dissolved. However, Sylvie remained sealed inside her crystalline prison. Alduin, attempting to strike a balance between justice and gratitude, began to speak, not as a monarch, but as a father. He thanked Arthur for saving the students of Xyrus, including his own daughter, Tessia, but his words were swiftly and violently interrupted. Dacid slammed his heavy fist against the armrest of his seat, reminding the council that they were assembled not as parents, but as the ruling powers of Dicathen. Queen Gloundra wasted no time in echoing her husband's sentiment. She coldly stated that Arthur had viciously mutilated and killed a fellow student, and she saw no reason to extend gratitude for his actions. Dacid continued, his voice rising with every word as he recounted the grotesque details of Arthur's so-called crime. He painted the picture vividly, both legs crushed beyond recognition, an arm torn off and seared shut, and the pelvic region shattered. Queen Priscilla attempted to interject, but Dacid ignored her and pressed on until Alduin finally shouted over him, demanding silence. The tension in the chamber was palpable. Queen Mariel then spoke, trying to steer the conversation back to reason. She reminded the council that, regardless of how brutal the act may have been, Arthur had risked his life and saved the students, her own daughter among them, and the remains of the academy itself. Dacid scoffed at the praise, brushing off Arthur's heroics as conveniently timed. He accused the boy of using the chaos as a cover to exact revenge on a rival, reducing the entire incident to petty vengeance in his eyes. Alduin rose, his voice resonating with both authority and exasperation. He challenged Dacid's claim, arguing that while Arthur's motives were unclear, the outcome was undeniable. He had saved lives. The academy might have been lost entirely had he not intervened. Still, Gloundra wasn't swayed by sentiment. She made it clear that while she did not advocate for Arthur's execution, she saw another path, one that would render him harmless. Her solution was to cripple Arthur, not as a boy, but as a mage. Dacid seized Gloundra's earlier words like a weapon, declaring that Arthur Leywin was simply too dangerous to be left unchecked. He questioned what might happen if Arthur and his dragon ever turned against them. Mariel, appalled by Dacid's suggestion, lashed back with disbelief. Her voice trembled with anger as she turned to Blaine and Priscilla, demanding their stance on the matter. Priscilla, choosing empathy over caution, echoed Mariel's sentiment. She and Blaine, as parents, were indebted to Arthur. Their children owed their lives to him, and for that, they were grateful. Yet Blaine, ever the diplomat, reminded everyone of their duty, not just as parents, but as sovereigns. He said that the Greysunders were thinking for the continent at large, out of concern for stability, not vengeance. But Mariel refused to accept such cold objectivity. Her voice rose with passion, questioning the heartlessness of it all. Then Alduin snapped. His fury, long simmering, erupted as he confronted the idea of crippling Arthur and killing Sylvie just to neutralize a hypothetical threat. The notion was not only unjust, it was cowardice masked as foresight, but Dacid wouldn't have it. He growled back, ordering Alduin to remember his place. Their exchange crackled with hostility. Alduin defended his right to speak, not as a subordinate, but as a ruler of his people, a father whose voice mattered. Dacid, eyes filled with contempt, reminded Alduin of his failures. His words pierced with venom as he brought up the lances under Alduin's care, one of whom had been lost due to negligence. The insult sent a ripple of outrage through the room. Priscilla was quick to condemn Dacid's cruelty, while Mariel stood in defiance, but Dacid remained unwavering, wielding the looming threat of war like a blade. He accused Alduin of endangering the continent by failing to protect one of their greatest military assets. In the midst of this firestorm, Arthur finally opened his mouth, trying to ask whether he had been summoned simply to hear his sentence, or if he was permitted to speak in his defense. But his words were cut short. Dacid roared at him to stay silent. He made it clear he had no intention of accepting any explanation, justification, or plea from the boy standing before them. Alduin, frustrated, accused Dacid of being irrational, challenging the flow of authority within the council. But amidst the heated discussion, Arthur, still composed despite the rising tension, raised his voice with restraint. He expressed the futility of his presence if he wasn't allowed to speak, if he couldn't explain his actions, his reasons. Gloundra, seated beside King Dacid, dismissed Arthur's attempt to speak. With cold finality, she declared there was no need for the boy to be present. Her command followed swiftly. Arthur was to be imprisoned, and his bond, Sylvie, locked away in a vault. King Alduin surged to his feet, his fury uncontained. He rebuked both Dacid and Gloundra, reminding them that the council did not belong to to them alone. From behind him, a shadow shifted. Aya, his ever-watchful lance, stepped forward in silence. She waited, ready for a command. Dowsid, unflinching, snapped back with venom. He reminded Alduin of his current weakness, the fact that only one lance remained under his control. The accusation hung in the air like a blade, and Alduin's defiance wavered. The room fell into a thick, uneasy silence before he slowly lowered himself back into his chair. Then came movement. The stone knights under Ulfred's command marched forward, their armor clanking against the marble floor. Without further discussion, Arthur was seized and escorted from the chamber, Sylvie taken separately. There would be no justice heard that day. As they walked the corridor leading away from the council, Arthur processed the reality unfolding around him. The dwarf royals, Dowsid and Glaundera, had turned fully against him. Meanwhile, the Gladers, Blaine and Priscilla were choosing to stay neutral, refusing to support either side openly. That neutrality, Arthur knew, was as dangerous as outright opposition. Descending a narrow flight of stone stairs through a less used corridor. At the bottom of the stairs, they entered the dungeon. The air was damp, thick with the scent of mildew and iron. Cells lined the walls, some rusted shut, others open and cold. Arthur's thoughts turned inward. Sylvie was too drained to understand what was happening, and in some way, he was grateful. She didn't deserve to suffer the weight of this betrayal. But in that moment, with so few allies left, Arthur realized the truth. His only hope might lie in Alduin and Marial. If they couldn't shift the council's stance, he and Sylvie wouldn't leave this dungeon unscathed. Finally, Ulfred spoke. The lance announced that this would be Arthur's cell. Sylvie would be held elsewhere, separated from her bond. There would be occasional visits. With the sound of the gate closing behind him, Arthur was left in the dark. In the dim solitude of his cell, Arthur tried to find solace in the silence. Yet, amidst the quiet, a frail, familiar voice shattered the stillness, tugging at his memory. His head snapped upward in disbelief. It was Director Cynthia Goodsky. Her voice weakened, but unmistakable. She, too, was imprisoned. Locked within the same bleak confinement, Cynthia revealed she had been held there for several days. Even news of the brutal attack on Xyrus Academy had been hidden from her. Arthur filled her in, recounting the chaos that unfolded at the very institution she once led. But something about her situation didn't add up. The council had turned on her shortly after her last meeting with them, without warning or clarity. As the conversation unfolded, Cynthia expressed quiet gratitude, then asked Arthur for more details about Lucas. Arthur recalled how Lucas had been under the influence of the same drug that had plagued the academy, though in his case, something was different. He had been stronger, far more dangerous, yet disturbingly lucid. Lucas had known exactly what he was doing. Cynthia listened carefully, probing deeper. She questioned whether Arthur had seen the mysterious leader who orchestrated the attack, but Arthur could only shake his head. He'd arrived too late. The figure had vanished by then. That response seemed to confirm something for Cynthia. Pieces were falling into place for her. She muttered about a plan already in motion, progressing faster than anticipated. Though she didn't explain, her demeanor grew more solemn, more cautious. Arthur, now on edge, demanded answers. Who were they? What was this plan? He was beginning to draw terrifying conclusions, ones he desperately hoped were wrong. But Cynthia pulled back, no longer claiming the title of director. She had been reduced to nothing more than the council's scapegoat. Whatever political games were being played behind the scenes, she had been sacrificed to protect their secrets. Arthur pressed on, but Cynthia's words grew strained. There were truths she was forbidden from sharing, bound by magic far older and more powerful than either of them could defy. Even speaking in vague riddles inflicted her with pain. A curse, one that activated with each forbidden word, held her in silent bondage. The idea enraged Arthur. The notion that she was being manipulated into silence, forced into isolation, while the real culprits moved freely, filled him with fury. He gripped the cold bars of his cell tightly, slamming his fists in frustration before collapsing back onto the floor. Cynthia, her voice weak but sincere, whispered one last apology. She had told him all she could. Arthur didn't respond. There was no point. The helplessness creeping into his bones left no room for words. He curled up on the cold stone floor, eyes staring into the void, trying to will himself into sleep as a cruel plan unfolded beyond their reach. Inside the secluded confines of Blaine Glader's quarters, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. The door slammed open with a deafening thud as King Dowsid erupted into the room, his fury barely contained. The Dwarven King stormed in, demanding answers with a snarl that echoed through the chamber. His voice was laced with betrayal. The agreement, one forged in secrecy and desperation, had been broken. To him, Blaine's inaction in the public chamber had been nothing short of treason against their cause. Blaine Glader remained composed, his face cold and voice even as he poured himself himself a glass of aged liquor. He acknowledged the agreement without hesitation, but made it clear that even loyalty had its limits. Arthur, the very boy they were conspiring against, had just saved the entire next generation of Dicathen, including Blaine's own children. To stand publicly and condemn him with baseless accusations was a line Blaine refused to cross even for Dawson, but Dawson was far from appeased. He slammed his fist on the desk and declared that without action, there would be no future generation to protect. Arthur and his bond, he insisted, needed to be surrendered to him. That was the only path forward, sacrifice a few to preserve what little remained. It wasn't just a strategy anymore, it had become dogma. Blaine's calm exterior began to crack. His voice sharpened as he reminded Dawson that he fully understood what was at stake. He didn't need to be hounded at every turn, but the reality weighed heavily on him. What they were planning, what they had already done, was nothing less than treason against their own people. Dawson's reaction was immediate and explosive. He shouted that there was nothing left to betray. The continent was on the brink of total annihilation. There would be no one left if they didn't act. In his mind, they were simply salvaging what was still possible, grasping at survival in a war they had already lost. And if that meant bending the knee to a higher power, so be it. That was the cost of leadership. But Blaine didn't flinch. He met Dawson's shouting with cold contempt. The justification did nothing to ease his conscience. They weren't saving anyone. They were abandoning their people for the sake of their own survival. Dressing it up as strategy or leadership didn't change what it was. Cowardice disguised as pragmatism. Dawson scoffed at the accusation. He claimed that yes, it did help him sleep at night. In his eyes, survival under him meant gaining new knowledge, new riches. It was a new world they would be part of, a world forged by submission and sacrifice. But Blaine's thoughts turned elsewhere. What would happen to the kingdoms of Sapin and Darve once they handed over Arthur? And what of Elenoir, already battered and burned? He didn't trust this mysterious force Dawson pledged to. There were too many unknowns, too much darkness behind the promises. Dawson dismissed the concerns with a wave of his hand. He claimed that the elves had always been too self-righteous to survive in the real world. They lacked the resolve to make hard decisions. They didn't understand what leadership truly meant. Under the flickering light of ambition and betrayal, Dawson's eyes burned with obsession. His mind swirled with visions of untold power and eternal youth, of riches so vast they would dwarf the wealth of all kingdoms combined. To him, the approaching Asura was not a threat but an opportunity, a godsend, immortality, strength beyond comprehension, wealth that knew no bounds. He believed all of it was finally within reach. The fantasy of lifetimes now seemed just one step away, and in his greed, Dawson had already begun to abandon everything else. His people, his oath, even his own humanity. But not everyone was as intoxicated by the dream. Blaine Glader stood apart, his heart heavy with conflict. Though his words never reached Dawson's deafened conscience, Blaine's soul screamed with restraint. He wasn't doing this out of lust for power. No, his path was carved by the weight of his lineage, the burden of preserving the Glader bloodline. A father first, a king second. The sacrifices he had made haunted him, yet he clung to the hope that his ancestors would understand, that they would forgive him for bartering away his conscience in exchange for security. His wife's desperation to protect their children was stronger than her loyalty to a crumbling kingdom, and Blaine could do nothing but follow that same desperate road. When Dawson finally left the room, only silence remained. Blaine was left alone with his doubts, the quiet void of his study echoing with the turmoil inside him. The luxury that once surrounded him now felt meaningless. All his life, he had yearned to become the strongest mage in Dicathen, not for vanity, but to honor his father, to live up to the legacy of his name. Yet, even with endless resources, elixirs, enchanted aids, privileged tutors, he had barely clawed his way into the red stage. That bitter truth gnawed at his soul. In his darkest moments, Blaine found himself envying those closest to him, his wife, his own children. He remembered how power had once blinded his father, and in those memories, Blaine had sworn never to lose sight of why power was needed, not for dominance, but for peace, for his family, for his people. But now, even with command over two of the lances, Blaine couldn't escape the gnawing sense of inadequacy that clung to him like a shadow. The fear that perhaps, just like Dawson, he too had begun to crave power for power's sake, not for noble reasons, but out of desperation to prove himself. An hour passed, drenched in silence and alcohol, until the haze gave way to hopeless clarity. No amount of drink could drown the misery. As he stood to leave, Blaine tripped, his footing lost to his drunken state. He crashed to the ground. The crystal glass he had been holding shattered a second before he did, the shards slicing into the arm he used to break his fall. Blood seeped onto the floor as he grit his teeth against the pain. How pathetic he felt, brought low, not by magic or battle, but by his own weakness. Memories stirred within Blaine as he stood in silence, haunted by the image of the boy he had once met. Long before his own children had returned from school, speaking in awe of Arthur Leywin, Blaine had already sensed something extraordinary about the child. That first encounter had etched itself so deeply into his mind that he had instinctively recognized Arthur as someone destined to shape the future. Yet now, that same boy was at the center center of a political storm. Despite his unmatched strength as a mage, it seemed Arthur's fate had been shaped more by misfortune than by magic. Caught in the coils of a conspiracy far beyond his making, he was to be offered up, an unwilling sacrifice. Blaine told himself that it was for the continent's greater good, that Arthur's downfall was necessary, but the words felt hollow, even in the privacy of his thoughts. While Blaine struggled with guilt and moral conflict in the real world, Arthur's consciousness was drowning in a nightmarish realm that blurred the line between dream and omen. The world around him was painted in cold shadows, and ahead loomed a monstrous structure, an ancient castle cloaked in darkness. Whether he moved toward the castle, or the castle itself crept toward him, Arthur couldn't tell. Reality twisted with every step he took. At the summit of the castle's tallest tower, a flag fluttered in the dead wind. The gates below towered above Arthur, laced with barbed wire and wicked spikes. Crows gathered atop the iron fence, their numbers growing with each passing moment. As Arthur reached the looming gates, his eyes locked with a crow, twisted in grotesque deformity. A strange compulsion gripped him, a need to know what these birds were feeding on. He tried to scream, to drive them away, but no sound left his throat. Even so, the crows scattered, obeying some silent force. And then he saw it. Impaled atop the gate were the severed heads of Tessia, his mother, his father, his entire family. The lifeless mouths hung agape, expressionless and empty, until they weren't. As Arthur reached to pull them down, those milky, expressionless eyes locked onto him. Then came the shrieks. Their heads screamed in unison, voices no longer human. From deep within their throats, writhing insects burst forth, spilling out like a grotesque wave. Their accusations rang out in haunting chorus, blaming him for it all. It was too much. Arthur's grip slipped, and he plummeted from the gate. The image of his desecrated loved ones burned into his mind. Even as he fell, their eyes continued to follow him, judging, damning, watching. His body jerked awake. Arthur gasped on the cold stone floor, drenched in sweat, breath ragged. The air felt thin, his muscles trembling, and his heart thundered with the weight of the nightmare. He looked down at his shaking hands, his only proof that he was awake, that it had only been a dream. But before he could recover, an unfamiliar presence stirred nearby. He turned sharply toward the source. In the shadows of the cell, a figure stood partially concealed, motionless and silent. Then the silhouette stepped forward. Her lips didn't move, yet her voice echoed directly into Arthur's mind. It was telepathy, precise and hushed. This was Aya Greffin, the second elven lance. Without delay, she approached him and leaned in, slipping a small parchment into his hand. Her voice, still silent to the ears but sharp in his mind, told him the message came from King Alduin Erlith. Then she vanished into the darkness. Arthur unfolded the note, his eyes quickly scanning the king's words. The letter didn't bring comfort. Instead, it confirmed what Arthur feared. King Alduin expressed regret for the recent calamity at Zyrus Academy, but this was no isolated incident. It was part of something far more insidious. In just a few hours, the council would officially brand Arthur and director Cynthia Goodsky as the orchestrators behind the attack. Cynthia was to be publicly executed, and Arthur, along with Sylvie, imprisoned. The king's influence, however, was powerless against the combined will of the dwarves and humans. Alduin then revealed a grim secret. He had overheard King Glader and King Dawsid speaking in hushed tones. They planned to deliver Arthur to someone, an unknown figure hidden behind the veil of politics and manipulation. It was the only reason Arthur had been kept alive this long. As a small gesture of protection and gratitude for all Arthur had done for Tessia, King Alduin had already dispatched his own father and loyal escorts to relocate Arthur's family to a secure, undisclosed location. Though it was far from enough, Alduin hoped this would offer Arthur a sliver of comfort. The letter ended with an apology. Even if Aya were to attempt freeing Arthur, the moment he stepped outside, the other lances would be alerted. There would be no clean escape. Alduin urged him to remain strong, to endure. As Arthur's grip tightened, the letter disintegrated into a soft ash, slipping through his fingers like fading hope. And just like that, the quiet dissolved into cold authority. Standing in Aya's place now was Baron Wykes. Baron gave Arthur no time to process. The council was waiting. Without speaking, Baron led Arthur out of the prison, their steps echoing heavily through the corridor. The silence between them was short-lived. As they reached the council chamber doors, Baron turned, his voice laced with bitter satisfaction. He relished the upcoming trial, already envisioning Arthur behind bars. And once that was done, he vowed to extend his twisted sense of justice to Arthur's family. Arthur questioned the very logic of a full-grown man picking a fight with someone half his age. But his words were barely out when Baron grabbed Arthur roughly by the collar, his grip tight, his expression full of cold promise. Arthur's fate was already sealed, and no amount of protest would change it. But Arthur didn't flinch. He met Baron's glare head on, his voice sharp with defiance. He reminded the Lance of the truth they all seemed so eager to forget, that Baron's own brother had chosen his path. It was Lucas who had joined the enemy, who had killed innocent students. Lucas had made his choices. Arthur had simply stopped him. That truth struck a nerve. Without another word, he hurled Arthur to the ground. The impact was hard, but Arthur pushed himself up, only to be met by another cruel turn of events. From inside the council chamber, chamber, Dawson's voice rang out with grim finality. The verdict had been delivered. Cynthia Goodsky, former director of Xyrus Academy, was to be executed publicly for her silence. Staggering to his feet, Arthur caught sight of Cynthia as she was escorted out between two guards. Her gaze met his, fierce and unyielding, though her clenched jaw betrayed the anger she fought to suppress. As Arthur approached the council, he kept his expression unreadable, a mask concealing the storm within. He studied each of the figures seated before him, noting who held power and who lacked the courage to wield it justly. Dawson, avoiding Arthur's gaze, flipped through a stack of papers as if the weight of a young man's future was nothing more than administrative burden. In a voice laced with false grandeur, he announced the council's so-called mercy. Arthur, for his crimes, would not lose his mana core, something considered a light sentence, but he would be stripped of his mage title and all honors it carried. He was to be imprisoned until further notice. The silence that followed was suffocating, until Dawson broke it with a cold prompt, asking if Arthur had anything to say. Arthur responded calmly, imprisoned until further notice. What did that even mean? Blaine answered that they would monitor the families of those affected by the incident, and when the memory of what had happened faded from public consciousness, Arthur would be released, not imprisoned. Arthur asked about his bond. The silence that followed was broken not with compassion, but contempt. Gloundra, seated with the other high rulers, slammed her thick palm on the desk, her voice sharp with disdain. She couldn't believe he would dare to ask for more, not after being granted mercy. Aldwin interrupted and answered with a somber weight in his voice. Arthur's status as a mage had been stripped, and with that, so too his right to keep his bond. It was law. There was no room for sentiment. Arthur didn't resist. With a stiff nod, he acknowledged their decision. Dawson's voice followed, smug and mocking. He assured Arthur that his bond, his companion, his friend, would be taken care of by someone powerful enough to handle her. The Glane instructed Baron to escort Arthur to his cell, ordering that he be chained. As Arthur was led away, he noticed the looks exchanged between the Dwarf King and Queen. Dawson and Gloundra didn't hide their smugness. Their haughty expressions were filled with satisfaction, and in that moment, Arthur felt a cold certainty. They were involved with the Vritra. Their smiles were too sure, too rehearsed. Baron, who had been seething with unspoken fury, said nothing during the march to the prison. When they arrived, Baron flung Arthur into the cell with force. Inside the cold cell, Arthur observed his bleak surroundings. Stone walls, iron bars. Yet as ironic as it seemed, this place felt more tolerable than the sterile, isolated white room he had previously endured. In a bitter reflection, he almost preferred this. At least it had weight. At least it was real. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, and familiar. Arthur looked up. A tall figure approached, and recognition struck him instantly. Winsome. There were no formalities, no surprise. Just the arrival of someone long overdue. Meanwhile, in the opulent chambers, a heavy silence lingered beneath the clinking of goblets. King Dawson leaned forward, raising his drink with a smug satisfaction curling his lips. He was almost trembling with anticipation, and beside him, Queen Gloundera mirrored his gesture with a faint, pleased smile. In his mind, he and Gloundera were no longer just rulers of the dwarves. They were destined to lead the entire continent into a new era, and the one who had chosen them to do so, the one whose power eclipsed anything the world had seen before, had approached them. Dawson's memories drifted to the first encounter. He had faced horrors in his youth, deadly mana beasts, battles that pushed him to the brink of death. His war axe, full cleave, had seen the blood of monsters and men alike, but nothing had evoked the terror he felt when that being revealed itself. That moment still haunted him. The overwhelming power, the sense of divinity. It wasn't just awe, it was fear. He had faced gods in that moment, and survived only because the god allowed it. Yet beneath the flattery and grandeur was resentment. Dawson seethed at how Aldwin and Blaine still dared to make light of his diminished state, mocking the power of dwarves in their veiled words. Once Dawson had stood above them all, stronger, unshakable. But that had changed. He halted mid-thought, realizing Gloundera was still unaware of the truth. The real reason his strength had faded, his mana core, once on the cusp of breaching boundaries, had been shattered, permanently damaged, not by a beast or a war, but by a peasant mage, a nobody. The memory clawed at his pride. That day, he had been caught in bed with the peasant's wife. The man had struck with desperation, fury, and somehow landed a blow that destroyed the core of a king. Dawson still couldn't believe it. The punishment he exacted, torture and execution, hadn't been nearly enough to quench the humiliation. To this day, he couldn't comprehend why the man hadn't just stepped aside, hadn't just accepted the honor of sharing his wife with royalty. Gloundera leaned closer to her husband, reminding him that their people admired him, worshipped him even. But Dawson knew better. Their obedience was born out of fear, not respect. Without the power of the two lances under his control, he believed the same people would revolt in an instant, tearing him from the throne they now bowed to. Gloundera, ever the ruthless queen, dismissed the thought with ease. To her, it was simple. Anyone who dared to defy Dawson would be killed. After all, he did possess the lances. He did hold power. power. And now, with the mysterious ally they had recently aligned themselves with, he would have even more. Dawson's voice grew wild with greed as he dreamed aloud. Of greater wealth, enhanced magical abilities, more loyal subjects, and above all, immortality to enjoy it endlessly. Gloundera's gaze sharpened as she leaned in, reminding her husband of something equally vital: fertility, the future of their bloodline. Driven by lust and ambition, Dawson began to undress her slowly, teasingly, relishing the moment. Gloundera moved with impatience, anticipation burning in her eyes. But just as passion reached its peak, the heavy door to their chamber slammed open with a thunderous bang. Fury erupted from Dawson as he roared at the guard for his insolence. But before the king could finish his threat, a cold, raspy voice echoed through the room. In an instant, the guard's body stiffened like a lifeless plank. A hole pierced clean through his chest, and he collapsed without another word. Dawson's rage twisted into fear as he faced the cloaked intruder who had entered their most private sanctuary. Terror flooded his core as he demanded to know who dared trespass in his presence. The stranger's reply was chilling. He knew exactly who the Greysunders were, and he had come to erase them. Just as a surge of deadly magic tore through the air toward the king and queen, a barrier of molten lava rose up, intercepting the attack. Ulfred, one of Dawson's loyal lances, had acted just in time. The magma shield crackled and hissed, barely holding against the force of the intruder's magic. Dawson stumbled back in disbelief, demanding answers from Ulfred. How had this intruder reached them? Ulfred, composed and seething, apologized swiftly. He had already notified Mika, the other lance. The intruder, he vowed, would not escape. But the enemy was unmoved. He stated coldly that he sought only the heads of the Greysunders and had no interest in unnecessary bloodshed. Ulfred stepped forward, his body igniting with intense crimson flames. He summoned his conjuration, 5 hulking soldiers of living magma that surged up from the ground, their burning forms advancing toward the intruder. Yet before they could make contact, the intruder moved. A blur of motion, so fast it escaped the eye, and the summoned magma knights disintegrated on the spot, collapsing into ash and glowing shards of stone that littered the marble floor. Determined, Ulfred invoked one of the most powerful fire-based defensive spells in existence, Hell's Armor. Dark crimson flames consumed him completely, coiling around his body like a demonic shroud of molten steel. With unwavering resolve, Ulfred launched himself toward the intruder. The flames around him intensified, his fist clenched with lethal intent. His blow descended, aimed at the intruder's face, but it never struck home. A wall of concentrated mana blocked the attack effortlessly, the collision rebounding with cataclysmic force. The explosion of energy sent Ulfred hurtling backward. A thunderous crash echoed as he smashed through the air, slamming against the far wall. When the smoke cleared, his condition was grim. His armored arm was mangled, bent unnaturally, his fist little more than shattered flesh and blood. The intruder stood untouched. Unbothered by the attack, he stared down at the broken lance. Deliberate calm, he extended a finger from which a slender blade of glowing energy took shape, sharpened, radiant with deadly precision. Then, in a moment too swift for human senses, the intruder vanished, only to reappear in front of Ulfred. The tip of the glowing blade now rested lightly against the lance's armored chest, and with a single word, the defense was undone. The mighty Hell's Armor cracked, splintered, and disintegrated into glowing fragments of mana. The impact was instant. Blood gushed from Ulfred's mouth as his body was thrown like a rag doll across the room, embedding into the wall with a sickening crunch. The intruder turned his gaze away from the fallen warrior, casually addressing the silent nobles nearby. He apologized for the delay, speaking to the Greysunders as though this brutal display were no more than an interruption. But before the air could settle, the ground trembled. Mika Earthborn had arrived. The young dwarf warrior, never one for subtlety, charged in from behind with a massive mace nearly twice her size. She launched her attack with devastating force, the sheer weight of her blow sending a seismic shockwave through the chamber, shattering stone tiles and shaking chandeliers. Dust exploded into the air, but the intruder stood unharmed, his form untouched by her assault. Within the swirling debris, Mika's familiar voice called out energetically, announcing her presence to the stunned king and queen. Dawson, shaken and clutching his wife, shouted back, urging Mika to act swiftly. Mika stepped forward with unwavering confidence, her massive morning star resting against her shoulder. Without hesitation, she hurled herself into the battle, her voice echoing through the chamber as she welcomed the enemy into her domain of combat. But the intruder, calm and unshaken, moved through the air like a wisp of smoke, evading her thunderous blow with unnatural grace. His steps defied the gravity field around them. The floor tiles beneath him shattered with every step, yet he closed the distance effortlessly. As she backed away, Mika's expression hardened. She focused more mana into her weapon, the air around it distorting under the gravitational stress. She leapt with a battle cry, the morning star surging downward with force enough to shatter mountains. Yet the strike never landed. With a single raised finger, the intruder halted the monstrous weapon mid-swing. The moment froze, and then a flash of light burst forth. A slender, glowing blade formed and pierced clean through Mika's body. Her eyes dimmed as her towering form collapsed, the weapon falling beside her with a resounding crash that echoed through the room. From across the battlefield, King Dacid stared in stunned silence. Inwardly, panic clawed at him. Mika, one of their most powerful lances, had been felled in an instant. In desperation, Gloundra's voice rose, her pride laced with delusion. She began to speak of Agrona of Vritra, of her husband's destined rise to power under a so-called deity. Her words were cut short as Dacid, consumed by fear and rage, commanded her to bow. She fell to the ground, forced into submission. This was no time for empty declarations. The intruder finally spoke, his voice cold and absolute. The idea of gods ruling this world was dismissed with disdain. There were no deities here, only asuras. Desperation oozed from Dacid like sweat, his cries for mercy becoming more pitiful with each passing breath. He groveled, pleaded, offered his loyalty, his dignity, anything that might spare his life. But the intruder was unmoved. His voice rang not with cruelty, but with the detachment of someone long accustomed to the pleading of doomed men. He saw Dacid not as a monarch, but as a pawn, one chosen carelessly by Agrona. Dacid panicked further, spewing excuses, denying any close allegiance with Agrona. He blamed threats, manipulation, coercion. His cowardice laid bare in every stammering word. Then came the demand: release the oath that bound the two lances. Confusion flickered across Dacid's face before horror settled in. Yet with a single glance from the intruder's narrowed eye, Dacid obeyed. He unclasped the artifact from around his neck, an heirloom imbued with ancient magic, and poured his mana into it. The oath seal fractured, and with its dissolution came a price. Blood seeped from the corners of his mouth as the backlash tore through him. He had been warned all his life never to undo it, but fear overrode caution. Survival drove his hands. The faint glow surrounding Mika and Ulfred faded, signifying their release. Dacid staggered to his feet, face pale, eyes wide with hope as he looked up once more. But that hope died in an instant. The intruder had never promised mercy. With no change in expression, he made his move. Dacid tried to speak, to protest, but only blood answered him, bubbling up from his throat as he collapsed. His life slipped away not with defiance, but in silent horror. His eyes, dimming rapidly, sought out Gloundra one final time. She looked back at him in disbelief, her arm outstretched weakly, her body soaked in crimson. A gaping wound had bloomed in her chest, and yet her concern was not for herself, but for him. The chilling words of the intruder echoed faintly in the void as Dacid's consciousness began its descent. The game of chess had begun, and Dacid was its first piece removed from the board. Back in the confines of the dungeon cell, a subtle trace of amusement curled at the edge of Winsome's lips, his sharp gaze glinting with unreadable thoughts. Arthur, feeling a surge of recognition and urgency, leapt from his seated position the moment he laid eyes on Sylvie. But even in his haste, his movements were gentle as he lifted her from Winsome's hand, holding her with an almost sacred care. Gratitude flickered in Arthur's eyes, but Winsome's expression remained reserved. He scrutinized Arthur, stern yet not unkind. Winsome remarked on the recklessness of Arthur's actions at the academy, not without a measure of reluctant admiration. Arthur's decision to risk himself and Sylvie had clearly frustrated the ancient mage. Arthur, however, stood by his choices. For him, the lives at the academy weren't just innocent bystanders. They were people he couldn't bear to sacrifice. When Winsome questioned whether his actions were all for the elf princess, Arthur's response carried the weight of much more. It hadn't been only for Tessia, it had been for the entire disciplinary committee, Ewis, and for Elijah, his best friend. Winsome absorbed this, but another question loomed. Why had the perpetrators taken Elijah? There had been no immediate reason to abduct him, yet they had. Arthur didn't know the answer, but what he did know, what now consumed his thoughts, was the need to find out where Elijah had been taken. There was no time for hesitation. With Winsome here, there was finally a way out of this prison. Arthur voiced his intent to go after Elijah, but Winsome met this with cold logic. Their investigations pointed to one possibility. Elijah had been taken back to Alakria. The very thought hollowed Arthur. He slid back against the damp stone wall, his gaze falling to the floor in quiet defeat. Silence hung between them for a moment, heavy and absolute. Winsome didn't mince words. He reminded Arthur of his current reality. Trapped, powerless. The notion of escaping alone was near impossible. And yet, Arthur dared to talk of rescue? To go into enemy territory, Alakria, for one boy. It was suicide. Yet Arthur couldn't abandon the thought. A part of him still held onto the hope that Elijah was alive, that there remained a chance to bring him back. So Arthur asked the question that lingered unspoken. If not that, then what? What could he do? Winsome finally revealed a sliver of truth that chilled Arthur further. The one known as Dreneve had already left before Arthur's arrival, which was fortunate in itself. The Vritra had a vested interest in keeping Arthur alive, for now. But that thin protection wouldn't last if they discovered the truth, that Arthur possessed Lady Sylvia's innate will, and carried with him her daughter, the last remaining hope of their bloodline. If that truth reached the Vritra, even the Asuras might struggle to shield him. Arthur's voice rose with frustration. He had risked everything to save the academy, and in return, found himself abandoned, cut off from allies, hunted by enemies, enemies and haunted by the loss of Elijah. Every option he once considered had crumbled. Alduin had turned his back. The council was tainted by the influence of the Vritra. His own mana signature had become a beacon, impossible to conceal. Hiding with his family would only endanger them, and the Beast Glades, once a potential refuge, would be suicide with the mana beast prowling relentlessly. He turned his gaze to Winsome, searching for direction, for anything beyond silence. But the Asura's face remained unreadable. He acknowledged Arthur's insight with quiet approval, recognizing that the boy had spent his captivity wisely, piecing together the fractured web of political alliances. Arthur's deduction was sharp. The Graysunders were clearly entangled with the Vritra, and while the Gladers had shown signs of allegiance, something about them felt hesitant, as if not fully committed. Time was pressing. Winsome checked a small timepiece strapped beneath his sleeve, ready to proceed with their next move. But before he could utter a word, a voice cut through the tense air. Another figure stood in the entrance of the cell, Baron, his eyes locked onto Winsome, instantly assessing the unknown figure as a threat. Without waiting for explanation or orders, he prepared to strike. Lightning surged to life around Baron's clenched fist, the air itself buzzing with power. A condensed orb of volatile energy formed and launched forward, a high-level flash ray spell designed to obliterate anything in its path. The bolt screamed through the air, tearing apart the cell's reinforced metal bars as though they were made of ash. But Winsome did not move. Calmly, the Asura extended his hand. The sphere of crackling electricity met his palm and stopped. There was no hostility in Winsome's expression, only a quiet finality as he addressed the attacking lance, offering a chance for peace. But Baron wasn't finished. With a sudden burst of energy, he invoked the Thunder Lance. 5 gleaming spears of lightning materialized, aimed to pierce Winsome from every angle. Yet once again, Winsome's response was near imperceptible. A simple, almost lazy flick of his wrist. In a blur, Baron's body was driven into the ground. The impact sent a violent tremor through the entire cell, shattering the floor in a spiderweb pattern. At the center of the destruction lay Baron, his face buried deep into the stone, unmoving. Baron, ever tense and hostile, was ready to strike again, until a voice sliced through the tension. Vare ordered him to stand down. Still trying to process the surreal situation, Baron hesitated, confused. But Vare quickly corrected him, reminding him that this was no ordinary being. This was a deity. Then, turning toward the intruder, she bowed her head, apologized, and conveyed the king's request for his presence. No further resistance came from Baron after that, and in silence, they moved. Arthur was unshackled this time. No chains, no restraints. The room they entered next was the same hall where his mock trial had taken place. The remaining 4 rulers, alongside Director Cynthia Goodsky, stood in solemn formation. All of them bowed deeply as Winsome stepped into the chamber, but there was someone else present too, an unfamiliar figure, standing with serene yet overwhelming authority. Winsome's voice came as a calm reassurance, gently guiding Arthur's attention. There was no sign of the Graysunders, though their absence was noted. Every face in the room seemed tense, except for the one man Arthur hadn't met before. The entity introduced himself with no preamble. His name was Aldir, another Asura, one who, alongside Winsome, had descended into this realm not for conquest or judgment, but for what he described as a final offering of survival. His declaration was cold and clinical. Aldir had already begun his purging of the corrupted, a cleansing of the council and its traitorous elements. His purpose now was singular: to assume control of what remained and guide the continent's lesser beings in preparing for the coming storm from Alakria. The word corrupted hung heavy in the room. For Blaine and Priscilla Glader, it struck like a blade. He tried to appeal to Aldir's superiority, to plead logic. If the Asuras were capable of such devastating might, why not let them resolve the threat? Why not simply crush the Vritra and end the war before it began? But Aldir dismissed the plea for a shortcut. The war was far more complicated than it appeared. The Vritra clan, along with 3 other clans beneath them, had once been Asuras themselves. Now exiled, they had broken sacred laws and turned against their own. A conflict between higher beings would not be a battle. It would be a cataclysm that could shatter the world itself. Long ago, a treaty had been forged, binding both sides. It forbade Asuras from waging war directly upon one another or interfering in the realms of lesser beings. To break it would risk annihilation far greater than anything the continent of Dicathen had yet known. Arthur's voice rose in challenge, questioning Aldir's supposed logic. He pointed out the contradiction in killing the Graysunders if they were truly aiming to avoid conflict. The weight of hypocrisy hung in the air, but Winsome quickly redirected the focus. He reminded the room that Dicathen now faced a threat governed directly by a Grona of the Vritra, an enemy who wouldn't foolishly violate the treaty over the Graysunders. But Arthur's frustration boiled beneath the surface. He clenched his jaw, unable to let it go. The Black-Horned demons, those nightmarish beings that had been invading their lands for years, hadn't just appeared recently. They had been operating in the shadows long before anyone realized. One of them had even killed a lance. Before anyone could react, Alduin stammered in shock, his voice faltering. The weight of Arthur's knowledge was clearly unexpected. The room fell into stillness as Director Goodsky stepped forward, lifting a shard of black crystal. It had once belonged to the very very creature that had ended Aaliyah Triskin's life. Alder turned to Arthur with a glint of recognition. Winsome had spoken of the boy's potential, but now Alder saw it for himself. Alder explained then, with solemn gravity, that the horned invaders weren't asuras. They were something worse. Creations, born of endless experiments on lesser beings, twisted into monsters. Once like Arthur, now abominations. The room darkened with the weight of this truth. Marial's voice trembled as the realization sank in. These monsters weren't gods, and yet they had the strength to kill the mightiest mages in Dicathen. The odds suddenly felt insurmountable. Was there any hope for victory? Alder reassured them, but his words were cold and strategic. Those monsters were not limitless. They were Agrona's trump card, held back now that Alder had revealed himself. His presence alone would force Agrona to act with caution. Alder, a general of the Asura, made it clear the Asuras had a stake in protecting this continent. Dicathen's survival aligned with their own. With that, Winsome gave a respectful nod to the three-eyed general and gently helped Arthur to his feet. Sylvie, still asleep, was cradled in his arms. Without waiting, Winsome began to lead them out of the chamber. Arthur's voice followed him, laced with urgency. He wanted to be part of the war councils, to stand in the discussions that would decide the fate of their world. But Winsome dismissed the idea calmly. Alder was more than capable of handling those preparations alone. There were more pressing matters ahead. Arthur would have to say his goodbyes. The words hit him like a cold wind. He asked where he would be going. Winsome's expression was resolute. Arthur and Sylvie would be leaving this world behind for now. Their training wouldn't happen in Dicathen. It would be held in Ephiotis, the homeland of the Asuras. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Until next time, happy watching.